Afternoon. My name is Shannon Douglas. I'm the author of Chasing Quicksilver. I am putting this video up today to respond to a question that a subscriber had about what kind of books have I read about tarot that have kind of led me to my understanding. Now, I've been studying tarot for about 25 years, and it was one of my first portals into symbolic thinking. And a guy by the name of Eric Weinstein talks about portals. In fact, he's got a podcast called The Portal as a methodology or a shortcut or a key to be able to unlock a set of ideas and understandings. And there are different languages and different sort of sets that we have and capacities that we have. And I was sharing some ideas with my kids a couple of days ago about when I get into fix-it mode. So I was trained as a renovations contractor. I've got broad skills in the trades that are useful, and that requires a certain kind of thinking. It's like I put on a certain process, engage in that process, and it's almost like I'm a different person. Some people who speak more than one language talk about having a slightly different personality or slightly different energy or sense of humor in one language over the other. And so tarot was one of those first portals that opened up a way of thinking for me that is much like perhaps some people experience who can play music, which I don't. And that's a whole thought process and a whole connection and energy and way of being in creating music and in playing music that requires a certain channel. So to me, tarot is like that. It opens up and it fosters and develops symbolic thinking. And I came to it after a couple of experiences that I had where I was trying to orient myself and believe it or not, ground myself in a practice that made sense to me. Now, so the first book I read on tarot, significant book, was the one that came with the first deck that I got. And that was called Legend. It had to do with the Arthurian Tarot. If you're a tarot reader, you may have books that came with your decks that give you explanations specific to that deck that you're reading. And then I moved on to a more broad analysis of tarot, some of the history. And I'm a trained researcher, so I did a fair amount of library work before the internet was invented. And I dug up all kinds of cultural history. So in my work in university, I dove down the rabbit hole of 50s and 60s American counterculture and drug culture, poetry, arts. The Haight-Ashbury set in San Francisco, the people like Andy Warhol in the 70s in New York City, Ram Dass and the psychedelic movement that was happening, an influence that was happening at Harvard University, Timothy Leary and people like that. So I went down quite a rabbit hole, and tarot was there waiting for me in terms of grounding. And so I looked back into, as a trained researcher, into where tarot originated as best as we can figure out. And I spent a lot of time reading about the occult revival period. From the 1840s, 50s, and 60s, development or the birth of new religions in the United States and actually international organizations like the Order of the Golden Dawn and the Theosophical Society. And I learned an awful lot about those groups because that informs a little bit of this way of thinking. But really the first book that I ever read that was an influence on me in terms of reading tarot and studying tarot is a book of myths. This is a well-worn book. It was published, this print was published in 1952. It was my father's English textbook when he was in school. I've read this 100 times. It was a companion with me when I was growing up and we were traveling. And this covers Greek myths, Norse myths, some Egyptian stories, and some Native American myths, at least as best as they could put together in 1952. And I've read a huge amount of books on mythology. I have probably a dozen compendiums of mythology and textbooks and analysis of of global mythology that I keep in my library, but this was the first one. So the first book I read on tarot was by a woman by the name of Eileen Connelly, and Eileen Connelly's been around for a long time. She's put up an awful lot of books, and this was one she wrote in 1979, Tarot for the Apprentice, and it really gave me a framework for thinking about numbers and the elements and the sort of progression of ideas and the court cards, and she laid it out very, very well in terms of how to think about the cards and in some ways how to memorize and work with the cards very quickly. So that was a great book on tarot, and that led me to numerology. And I read a couple of books on numerology. Now, when you're getting into the New Age, quote-unquote New Age stuff, there's an awful lot of stuff that's trite. I don't want to be disrespectful, but it's very surface level, and it doesn't go into any real depth. And it's tantalizing and titillating, and little kitchen witches spell books and things like that. They border on the superstitious, okay. But I think there's truth and core and kernel in all of these things. And this is actually a textbook. This is Language Visible. I live in Ottawa, Canada. I believe this was written by an Ottawa author, and it goes into the history of the symbols of our language and our alphabet and where those symbols came from. So part of the crossover with numbers and symbols is that in the Phoenician alphabet and the Hebrew alphabet, letters are interchangeable with numbers. So A, or what was known as Aleph, or Alpha, was equivalent to the number 1. And there was a structure of interchangeability of values in the numbers, or the values for the letters of the alphabet, as a way of accounting. So you could look at a symbol, and it could be a number or it could be a letter, depending on the context. And those were the core symbols of our alphabet that we have today. They were the original 22 Phoenician symbols, and they became evolved into the Hebrew alphabet, and then we added vowels later on and part of this was developing phonetics and the language of phonetic spelling. So numbers and letters, I often say tarot is ABCs and 1, 2, 3s. It's very worthwhile studying numerology and studying a little bit of gematria, understanding what the letter symbolism is. The people who created the Rider-Waite deck, coming from the Order of the Golden Dawn, held an idea that the 22 cards of the major arcana of tarot corresponded to that 22 letter symbolic inventory or symbolic set that became our alphabet. There's a huge number of books I could go into. So I went through, I don't want to say Eastern phase, because I think my thinking is deeply shaped by Eastern philosophy and tradition. My favorite book, and I have 4 or 5 translations. Not sure if we can get this. Here we go. The Essential Tao, the Tao Te Ching. This is Thomas Cleary translation. And then, of course, contemporary of Lao Tzu is Kung Fu Tzu, Confucius. And interesting guy, Zhuangzi. This is a Thomas Merton translation, a great American translator and poet. This is tied to Taoist philosophy. And then things like the Yoga Sutras, and have over here the Upanishads, a good collection of Chinese and Indian thought. And why is that? So if we think about the Indian caste system, there's 4 castes within Indian society, and those 4 castes kind of correspond to the 4 suits of tarot. And there's some storytelling that suggests that these 4 suits, imagine the 4 knights or the 4 kings, or the 4 queens for that matter, being leaders and influencers within the caste, ranking members of the caste. And that way of thinking, the Wheel of Fortune is another one. There's a lot of symbolism in this, especially in Hindu philosophy, around the wheel and the meaning of the cycles and the cyclical nature of the wheel itself, and our life and existence on that wheel of life, stuck in something called samsara. So I view tarot a little bit as a collection of stories and influences, and we all have the opportunity when we're building our relationship with tarot is to build and associate and connect stories to the cards that we have and that we're reading. And those things happen over time. They don't happen overnight. So I see videos online saying, "Oh, learn the major arcana in 2 hours." Well, I spent 25 years, and I still learn stuff now when I open the deck. It manifests and evolves in different ways. And the more I read and the more information I take in, the deeper and richer the kind of vocabulary that I have that I can associate with tarot. Now, I imagine and envision the major arcana, for example, as a filing cabinet in my mind, a way of memorizing and remembering concepts, and within a whole inventory, within a whole psychology. And so, I've got a file for the Fool, and when I'm contemplating the Fool and the archetype of the Aleph in the beginning of things, I have a whole collection of stories that go along with it that I've connected and kept in that file and added to it over the years. Now, a couple of modern thinkers, you can't get into any kind of mythology or storytelling without Joseph Campbell. Joseph Campbell wrote a foreword on a book of tarot, and it's only a foreword. It's probably 25 pages, but he does address turning the cards and shuffling them and understanding the structure. The Hero with 1,000 Faces, the hero's journey, is the journey of the Fool. It's either a tragic journey or a heroic one. Staying within the sort of influences within tarot, this is a book on the Kabbalah, the mystical Kabbalah by Dion Fortune. She was part of that occult revival period. And I have a bunch of her stuff. Some of it's channeled. It's really kind of weird. Some of it's dense. Some of it's using, inaccessible language and things like that. But as a general map and a reference piece for what the Sephira are and the 22 paths and the Tree of Life. The Tree of Life appears all through tarot. The first time you see it is in the Priestess card, where you have the two pillars, Boaz and Joaquin. Those represent the left wing and the right wing of the Kabbalah, or the pillars of mercy and severity. So you can see, and you can actually see in the background of the traditional Priestess card, this figure, this glyph of the Tree of Life, in the form of pomegranates in the background. What else we got? Horoscope symbols. This is a book by Robert Hand. Robert Hand was a major influence in astrology over the years, and he's a mathematician and was an original creator of astrology software for doing astrology readings. This is a book on the symbols, not specifically on reading itself. So, a chance to get to know the planets and their influences, which we see all through tarot. Then a little bit into psychology. William James really in the 1890s for this one, a classic, Varieties of Religious Experience. And then a few years later, a bit of a controversial figure, Mircea Eliade. He had early ties to right-wing beliefs in the post-Nazi era, we look at a lot of historical figures now and kind of questions what some of their beliefs were and whether they were, we're going to cancel them or not. But he was a tremendous researcher, and he removed his own views as far as I can tell in his history of religious ideas. That gives a global understanding of religions. One of my favorite books, period, Eastern Body, Western Mind by Anna Dea Judith. She's a PhD in psychology, and this is a map of the chakra system, very similar to the Kabbalah. Carl Jung. I've got a dozen or 15 books by Carl Jung, and you really got to want to study Jung. And it's not a weekend cottage read to crack open, the archetypes or alchemy and symbolism or personality types. It was a dense kind of exploration, and I've read quite a bit of that. Now, the other thinker that's a big influence on me, and this is the last book I got in the stack here, I think, and I just grabbed one of my Ken Wilber books off the shelf. Ken Wilber wrote a book called The Spectrum of Consciousness. This came out in the late 70s. As far as I can tell, he was a big influence on the comic book creator Alan Moore, who wrote the graphic novel The Watchmen. And if you are familiar with The Watchmen, there's a character in that movie, Dr. Manhattan. He's blue, he's bald, he's he's blue, he's tall, and chiseled features, and has tremendous psychic powers that he acquired through some superhero accident. And he's a significant figure in the book. It's pretty hard to argue that Alan Moore didn't base his character, this person with enlightened experience and perception, on Ken Wilber, the thinker and philosopher. Ken Wilber's still alive. He lives in Boulder, Colorado. Spectrum of Consciousness is an extremely worthwhile book to read because it describes what we know as the great chain of being. But the chain of being is this: what's the evolutionary chain through the animal kingdom, for example, or through our own development, through our hero's journey. And he wrote about this spectrum from a values perspective, and from an experiential perspective. So in our pre-verbal, even in the womb, we have this sort of pleromatic consciousness. And then as we start to grow, and he demonstrates parallels with people like the psychologist Piaget, we get into distinguishing ourselves from the environment, developing an ego, developing social reference points, going through stages of development. And that's the story of the major arcana as I see it. It is a description or an account of a journey through the great chain of being, coming into the material world, encountering the patterns and the structures of the material world, and understanding our own consciousness, or experiencing it, or filtering the world through it, coming into the archetypes of mother and father and society, and that's a developmental process. So Ken Wilber's fantastic read. He is a little bit challenging. A lot of people have difficulty. It took me about 4 years to really have the aha moment with Ken Wilber. And I probably he's written prolifically. I've read 15 books at least by Wilber over the years. Anyhow, those are some of the influences. And of course the other one that's the big one, pardon me. Holy Bible! A tremendous amount of Christian archetype and influence in the tarot, and it's worthwhile knowing some of the stories and being able to have a vocabulary within that mythic cohesive set and description of the universe, just like the Bhagavad Gita or the Upanishads, or some of the Hindu heroes and Chinese heroes and their narratives and stories. The bigger the vocabulary we have, or the more widely we're read, I think the more profound our tarot interpretation and experience can be. So that's kind of the broad strokes of my bibliography around tarot. And of course, I focused down here on this particular subject because lots and lots of people ask questions about it. And my most popular videos have been about tarot, but I've put as much energy and thought and contemplation and meditation into these other disciplines, like astrology, for example, or numerology. I understand how all these systems work. I spent a long time and still utilize the chakra system concept for my own meditations and energy work and things like that. And so tarot's part of a large suite of of subjects that we can explore on our spiritual journeys as we're growing into ourselves, figuring out who we are, developing our own power and will, and our own sense of who we are in the world. My name is Shannon Douglas. I'm the author of Chasing Quicksilver. You can get a free audio copy of the first couple of chapters of that book from my website at www.chasingquicksilver.com.